This is CinePunked. This episode, Iceberg, Dead Ahead. The ghost of Titanic has loomed large for 110 years, the greatest luxury liner of its day, the pinnacle of modern engineering, and doomed never to complete its maiden voyage. A collision with an iceberg in the cold of the North Atlantic on the evening of 14 April 1912 resulted in the loss of the ship, and with it, some 1,500 lives. Within days, its story was being told in newspapers, cinema screens and books, the legend often overshadowing the truth. In 1955, the American writer Walter Lord penned his narrative of the events of that fateful night in book form, as a night to remember. Based on dozens of eyewitness interviews from survivors, it remains in print to this day. In the winter of 1957, Belfast-born producer William McQuitty and English director Roy Ward Baker assembled a crew at Pinewood Studios and commenced filming their adaptation of Walter Lord's book. Released in July 1958, it connected with audiences all over the world, allowing the general public to experience the disaster in an authentic way. Over 60 years have passed since the film's release, and it is still regarded as the definitive account of the disaster. And yet, in light of James Cameron's fictional Jack and Rose love story of his 1997 film Titanic, A Night to Remember is in danger of slipping into obscurity. In this edition, we're going to refocus the attention on the influential 1950s film. Tonight's team, scrambling for the collapsibles, our science fiction novelist and film theorist, Dr. Rachael Kelly, here playing the part of everyone's favourite rags to riches good time girl, the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Hello.
Sneaking off at Queenstown is our own Father Brown, Mr. Films and Faith, Neil Sedgwick.
Good evening, although I would quite like to be everybody's favourite rags to riches girl as well.
Too bad, I've claimed it.
And I guess your unwitting Captain Edward Smith for this evening is played by none other than me, Robert J.E. Simpson. I have to say that might be a particularly nerdy intro that's lost even on my colleagues. One for the Titanic nerds out there. There's one or two listening, I hope. So look, this seems like a really, really obvious thing for us to do. We're all from sort of the greater Belfast area. Titanic was a ship that was built in East Belfast, in the heart of the Mulf shipyards. I know, Neil, this is a shock to you. You've never heard this before. Certainly, and also, I think, significantly, now Ben was supposed to be with us tonight. Unfortunately, he's not been able to join us at the last minute. But we're actually also of that generation that were kids when the ship was rediscovered, and that whole wave of sort of 1980s and 1990s love for the Titanic story kind of came about again. So, like, I wonder if our relationship with this is sort of slightly different, but it strikes me that, you know, with our own kind of local knowledge and the fact that, I mean, certainly for me at school, they taught us this stuff as well as a local history project. It seems inevitable that CinePunked should actually cover a Titanic film at some stage. And here we are 6 years in before we finally get round to one.
The 14th of April, 1912. A night to remember. A night when the largest, most luxurious liner of her day was speeding across the North Atlantic on her maiden voyage. No expense had been spared to make this ship a symbol of man's final victory over nature. Her first-class passengers were the very cream of society, the aristocrats from Europe and millionaires homeward bound to America. In the steerage class, everyone enjoyed their own kind of boisterous fun. Then there were the second-class passengers and the crew. 2,208 happy, confident people speeding across a flat, calm sea in a ship that everyone knew was unsinkable. Absolutely unsinkable. The ship was called the Titanic.
What did you see?
Iceberg, dead ahead, sir!
Had either of you seen A Night to Remember before this?
I had not, but I'd always meant to. And I'm really glad I have seen it now.
I am shocked that you have not seen this before this week.
Oh, come on.
I know you have gaps. I know there are gaps in the Rachael canon, but this one actually genuinely surprises me.
It was on my to-be watched list, but unfortunately my to-be watched list is more of a kind of a thing in my head than an actual list. So when it comes time to pick a film to watch, I can never remember what films are on that list. So I did really want to watch this one. But yeah, no, I wish this was the first and only Titanic film I'd ever seen. I feel like after this one was made, the entirety of Hollywood should just packed up and gone, that's it, guys. That's all we need to do. Job done. No more Titanic films. We've done it.
You've seen James Cameron's film, I take it?
Yes.
You don't like?
Well,
you're allowed to express an opinion on it. Like
This is going to sound like a ridiculous thing to say about a film about the Titanic, but it was spoiled for me. I didn't know it sank, but okay. I didn't know Jack died until I was chatting to friends, and they were like, "Yeah, and then he dies at the end." I was like, "Oh, great, thanks for that."
Spoilers.
It's been 25 years.
Spoiler 2, he's not real.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And it's fine, and I like it fine. I like a disaster movie. I mean, probably more than the next person. I'm prepared to sit through some inexorable shit because I just love CGI disasters happening and it all being really sort of high octane and stuff. And I like that aspect of it. I thought that was really gripping, but I fail to see why we needed a fictional love story to make us care about the worst maritime disaster in history. Why do we need these two made up people to kind of give us an emotional access point? It's the Titanic sinking.
Let's come back to that because I think it's a valid point in terms of how we talk about A Night to Remember and what A Night to Remember is doing, particularly in comparison to Cameron's film. Neil, have you seen A Night to Remember before this week?
I saw it once when I was 12. So, hang on, let me do quick math. 29 years ago. So this was part of my first year history class.
Okay.
In Wallace in Lisburn. Shout out to anybody from Wallace listening.
Yo.
I did not enjoy your school.
You used to kick my school's ass at rugby, by the way.
That's
so kudos.
That's a booking we're never getting, by the way. No, sorry. But we had to watch it. We did Titanic, covered Titanic in first year, and we had that wonderful day where the TV got wheeled in.
Oh, the
those
TV
were
wheeling
good
in.
days.
Oh man,
yeah.
TV got wheeled in. Video put on. And we had
actual video cassette, just for any young listeners.
Yeah, video cassette slotted in. It sounded like the room was going to shake as it went down into the top loader. And we sat and watched this because it was a double period, which covered us for the entirety of the movie. Or just about. I think we whizzed through a few credits just to kind of trim to get us in the time. But then my memory of it is that we turned the lights back on at the end of it, and the whole room was in tears, and all the fellas were trying to hide it, and there's just everybody was really upset by what unfolded. So that's that. I haven't seen it since, and I put it on a couple of nights ago, and yeah, I didn't have a lot of kind of memories from it, in terms of narrative or anything like that, but I mean, I have seen it before all those years ago.
You've seen the Cameron film as well, I take it?
I don't think I ever have.
Oh, you lucky man! You've dodged a bullet.
I think I've seen clips, and I've seen memes and stuff like that. Like he
7
would have
hours of your life you'll never get back.
Did he just try and say memes floating around?
Yeah, memes floating around. Like literally, he would have fitted on that door. That type of stuff that goes around.
Yeah.
To be fair, I have seen that persuasively argued that it's not about him fitting on it, but it's about surface area and buoyancy and stuff.
Shout out to Mythbusters who've covered that at length.
I've seen bits of it, and little clips and little sections kind of thrown through the artistic work of Celine Dion's video, music video back catalog. But no, I do remember seeing one scene in it, which I found incredibly sad, which is two old people lying on a bed, just consigned to their fate, which is very, very moving. But no, I couldn't honestly say I've sat down with the whole thing. My wife is trying to get our girls to sit down and watch it at the minute. For some reason, before we decided to do this podcast, there was this conversation one night of we need to watch Titanic, and I was like, do we? Do we really? But they're blocking all attempts to watch it.
Have to say, no, I mean, I would have sat, I had somehow managed to not see it for 20 odd years. I was meant to go see it for a date several times in 1997 and somehow didn't manage to get to any one of the outings. And then I was just one of those films I thought, I'm never seeing this. I missed my chance. I didn't get to see it in the cinema. Why would I ever bother watching it? And then a few years ago, when Titanic started being part of my professional life, my interest is with the film stuff, so I went and rewatched in most cases a lot of the films. But I finally went and picked up Titanic on Blu-ray, and I watched it, and I've got it in 3D as well, the 3D version of Titanic. Which I also have Titanic 2 in 3D, which is not.
They said it was unthinkable.
That's a whole other podcast. But I mean, so there's an added incentive to go and kind of watch this. Because I quite like 3D stuff. It makes it a bit more interesting. But I would say that I think it's probably worth watching. I mean, certainly for me, I got enough out of it, and ignoring the Jack and Rose bit, which is fine. But
how do you ignore the Jack and Rose bit, though?
Because there's so. I mean, in terms of Titanic stuff, it's fair to say that I've got a bit of an interest in this thing. I have Walter Lord's book here, and I have to remember that I got. It's dated inside. I got this when I was 10. So I have lived with this for 30 years, this story, and love this stuff. So for me, it's like all the other bits that actually are drawn from real stories that are in Cameron's film, the aesthetics of it, like he captures that ship in a way that you don't see anywhere else. It's a lot of it is fairly accurate. It's just there's the whole love story thing that goes on in the middle of it. But so for those of you who haven't seen Titanic in any version, the basic story is massive ship built in Belfast, and A Night to Remember covers the story where it goes out to sea. So it starts its journey in Southampton. It skips the bit where it goes to Cherbourg and then to Queenstown, so France and then Ireland, and then goes off into the Atlantic. And then 4 days into its first voyage, they unfortunately strike an iceberg and sink. And the film is as much about the events leading up to the striking of the iceberg and how people coped in that 2.5 hour window between striking the iceberg and the ship going down. And that's it in a nutshell. I mean, there's not really much more you can say about the plot. I mean, we give it away at the start. We all know the ship sinks. It is a disaster movie, but it is doing something slightly different, I think. I mean, this is a film that is based on eyewitness accounts, often verbatim.
And it allows that to be the story. I mean, that is all the story that you need to tell, ultimately, is this ship struck an iceberg and it sank, and it was horrendous. And it was a terrible way for a lot of people to die. And I don't understand why that actually needs to be embellished, why that's not enough of a narrative, because ultimately everybody knows how this story is going to end. So doing anything sort of frilly or fancy with that story is extraneous, surely.
When producer William McQuitty took this story to get investment for the film, and a shout out for seeing as we're all doing old school ties tonight, shout out to William McQuitty, who's like me, an ex-pupil of Campbell College in East Belfast. So yay, a school that actually I got more good out of than bad. And also occasionally we beat Wallace at rugby, apparently, which is a good thing. I don't know.
There's a hierarchy of rugby going on here. So
I know, but we're also not people who give a shit about rugby.
Campbell beats Wallace, which beats Methody. So, you know.
It's for people from outside Northern Ireland going, what?
This really niche reference there.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter.
So when William McQuitty actually went to try and get investment for the film, they did say to him that basically there was no star. They wanted a star, but also like nothing happens. It's like the ship goes down, like that's it. And he couldn't understand why it was that you want to make a story about that. And he had to argue the case that was the story, that it's about all that other stuff that you don't need. I mean, the ship is the star of the film. It's not about anything else. That's the thing that people are going to see. It was a brand in its own right. So it's an album, but this wasn't the first time the Titanic story had been told. It's been told multiple times on screen, even before this point. Do you know when the very first film was made about the ship?
1912, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Do you know how quickly after the film went down that it was made?
No, I'm a bit scared to find out.
28 days.
Good grief.
An actress called Dorothea Gibson, who actually had been on the ship and had survived, then relived her trauma, wore the actual dress that she wore on the night, and made a fictionalized version of her story on board the ship. It's only 10 minutes long. It's now lost. It's a lost film, unfortunately. It's called
Saved from the Titanic.
But she made this film, and it would have been screened as part of various reels, but it was her fictionalized version of her story. And I think it also prompted her to relive her trauma to the point where she gave up the film industry after that. She was slightly traumatized by it. But that was how quickly there was interest in it. Now, there was quite a flurry in the year or two after in terms of sort of all the inquests and stuff that went on. And then it kind of ebbs and flows. I mean, there's a version of this film made in the 1920s. It turns up in an old card film, Cavalcade. It's a play as a backdrop to that. The Nazis, Goebbels, made a film about this, which is quite good.
Is it, though?
I mean, it's a weird kind of thing. But he has a very clear propaganda aim with it, and about how the Brits are kind of egotistical, money grabbing people, and
terrible engineers.
Basically, and it's all big. It's a great one for anyone who's really into their conspiracy theories. It fits so well into modern conspiracy theories in terms of this is all part of a master plan in order to manipulate the stock exchange. So I mean, they had done that, and in fact, there are a few scenes from the Nazi Titanic that are in this film as stock footage. And then there was a big American production, which again actually played out a disintegrating love story on board the ship with a couple that are divorcing, are kind of thrown into the middle of the Titanic disaster. So I mean, that idea that there were other sort of you put on other fictions isn't that unusual. But I think you're right. I mean, it didn't need them.
No, it's sort of it baffles me as to why that story isn't considered, generally speaking, enough of an emotional hook. I mean, what also baffles me is the obsession in this part of the world with the Titanic. It's sort of like, there's two things that we do. We blow stuff up and we sink ships. That's what we want to be known for. So we're going to make museums about them, because that's all we got. We've got the Giant's Causeway. That's really nice. Some lovely rolling countryside. Come see that. That's lovely. But what I if you're going to tell the story, and I really do understand the impetus to tell the story and to try and make sense out of something so awful. I mean, it particularly given the circumstances around, people got on that. I was reading about one survivor, Edith Russell, was told that she tried to insure her baggage when she got on. She had loads of stuff, like she was a fashion designer, I think, coming from Paris, and she had loads of really expensive stuff, so many that she actually hired another berth for them, put them all in there, and tried to get insurance to cover it, and she was refused insurance because the ship was unsinkable. She apparently got one of the biggest settlements against the White Star Line after the sinking, because clearly that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I've got to try and avoid this becoming a Titanic nerd out for an hour, because I mean, I'm well versed in some of this stuff. It's not what we're here to do. But with someone like her, I mean, first of all, that line about it being unsinkable was never actually said by the White Star Line. I mean, that's a myth. That's one of the myths that have been perpetuated. There were various newspaper reports that basically said that the safety precautions that were on board made the ship in such a way that it was perceived to be unthinkable. There was a bit of a caveat amongst that, but it was never the people who actually built the ship that said that.
I believe Andrews sort of was arguing for much greater safety measures to be taken that were ultimately jettisoned for cost reasons.
It's sort of alluded to at the end of the film whenever it talks about the changes that were made that basically influenced shipping today. But one of the big things was the number of lifeboats.
As far as I can see, she made 14 feet of water in the first 10 minutes after the collision. It's not very fast. She should live another hour and a half. Yes, about that, I think.
There must be no panic.
No.
You'll be careful what you say to the passengers.
Of course. How many people are there on board?
2,200 or more. And room in the boats for... how many?
1,200.
I don't think the Board of Trade Regulations visualized this situation. Do you?
At that time, there was 2,200 people on board Titanic. Titanic wasn't even full. You could have had another 1,000 people on that ship easily. Because of the Board of Trade regulations at the time, they only had to have 16 lifeboats, enough provision for about 1,100 people. That's half of the number of people who were on board. That was potentially a third of the number of people that could have been on board. Of those, only 700 people saved, just over 700. So there's still space for another 400 people on board those lifeboats. Andrews had wanted to have enough lifeboats there for everybody. And there was a push for it, but it did partly come down to cost at the time. And all those people are involved with it. Ismay was involved with it. Andrews was involved with these conversations, and also there were other things that changed after. I mean, there's a bit in the film where they make a big deal about the fact that the watertight bulkheads only go up so far. There were modifications made to the Olympic, the sister ship, and the Britannic, which was built after, both in Belfast, and future ships as well, in terms of making sure things like that were adjusted. It's the benefit of hindsight. And I think that's one of the things that for me always strikes me about the film. I mean, I sat watching this again last night. I've seen this film a number of times. I know many of the stories about the people who are on board the ship, and I find myself welling up. You know, there's a point
I have to agree. I mean, for something where you know the story so well, to have that kind of emotional impact. I mean, I was in tears at the end of it. I desperately wanted those people to be okay. And those people that we hadn't spent a lot of time getting to know, generally speaking. We were sort of little vignettes, little tiny insights into their lives. The guy who tells his wife, better wake up the children, the fairly well-off guy, Lucas, tells his wife, it's totally fine, just you jump in, knowing that it's the last time he's going to see his wife or his children, knowing that he is effectively sentencing himself to death. And, I feel like, I hadn't really registered him up to that point. I know the film, I kind of spent a bit of time with him here and there, but immediately I cared. I was devastated for this man.
Robert, I can't go through.
It looks as though we shall have to forego the drive down to Philadelphia and take the train.
I can't leave you here, Robert.
Cousin Henry won't mind us being one day late, but he'll draw the line at 2.
I'm not going, Robert.
My dear, I never expected to ask you to obey me, but this is one time you must. It's only a matter of form for you and the children to go first. Everyone here will be quite safe.
Is that the truth?
Certainly it is.
And, by the end of it, when the steward is cuddling this little lost boy, it's going, Mummy will be here soon, Mummy will be here soon. I was in bits, knowing, and even, knowing that it was going to happen, robs it of none of its emotional impact whatsoever.
Yeah, part of the conversation in our house was, along those same lines, where it's like, if I was in that scenario, could I do that? Could I just very calmly and assuredly go, just get in the boat, everything will be okay, I'll see you on the other side. Don't like that. And I think one of the things about it is when the realization hits the bulk of the passengers on the boat, and the kind of crush happens. There's something about crushes of crowds and kind of that chaos of humanity that is really quite terrifying and feels very real. And that all helps add to the emotional side of it too, I think, because it is genuinely the kind of, and it's not particularly violent, but there is a moment where somebody says, "Now we will have to get the guns just in case."
Yeah.
And at that point, then there's actually like a tonal shift happens in terms of the music, and people become more agitated and things like that noticeably happen in the film.
Yeah.
And because up until then, it all felt fairly procedural. Because you do see some people getting on the ship and their stories of, this family from Ireland, they're all going for a better life. Bagora, but Jesus.
Bagora. Yeah, there was a lot of that. I was.
There's a lot of kind of, what do the Irish say? Well, none of that. Actually, none of that. But
I just say it all the time.
There's that bit where it's like you whiz around that, but a lot of what happens is kind of the procedure of what happens when it goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What messages get sent out, how they are communicating with those around them. Are they being heard? Are they being listened to? In the case of one boat, there's just two fellas on it going, what should we do something about? I don't know. Nah, it's probably fine. Just leave it.
Well, that's the Californian.
Californian, yeah.
Captain Lord of the Californian sued after this.
Right.
He was not happy. His family actually still are not happy, and you'll see them pop up. We're talking about this like in Titanic Memorial Month. They pop up every now and then, still complaining about the way that he's represented in most of the films. They're still trying to defend his honor. There's all sorts of theories about what else was going on that night. Also, J. Bruce Ismay's family, depending on who you speak to, some of them get quite vocal about the way that he was represented in the film. Although actually watching last night, I thought he's only ever described as the chairman in the film. He's not given his name in order to kind of slightly ease any potential for defamation. But he was made out to be the scapegoat for this whole thing, and his reputation was sullied in tatters, and he was a broken man in the end. I've met some of his family, some of his descendants who, talk quite openly about this and about how that affected him and about how the family feel about this as well. So it's strange, there is there were people who weren't happy with how they're seen, because what we also forget is that because this film is very strongly based on people's actual accounts, a lot of these people are identifiable. Now, Roy Ward Baker amalgamates some of the characters, because you can't tell 200 stories in 120 minutes as hard as you might try. So you pick two or three together. And Walter Lord himself said that, this was sort of okay because it served the dramatic purpose and the essence is all still there. It's not that it's not true, it's just you having to mold some people together. But because they're all identifiable, it means people feel quite precious about this. We're caught up in an era where everything's about how to behave. Like, you're asking the question, how would we respond in that situation if it was us? And people have very clear ideas about how they feel one should behave. The idea about what makes a gentleman. Well, we're going to put on our finest dinnerware and we're going to go and smoke cigars and play cards and die. And that's fine. There's a different kind of morality at play here. There's a different kind of perception. And when somebody is then, accused of having maybe behaved differently, possibly because they have PTSD or are in shock, then their reputation is sullied. Although Captain Lord, from what I've read, probably could have done a lot more. The fact that they see that ship and they never really try to do anything about it, just
it's interesting, that idea of, I think probably as well, like the generational trauma, not just the trauma of the victims as such, but the continuing trauma of the families of everybody involved. Like, every time there's a Memorial Month, or there is, we're going to make a new Titanic film, you know, it couldn't. It would be impossible not to be, I suppose, triggered in some way, and it may be positively for those who feel like their stories were well told, but there's bound to be those, as you say, who just have that kind of negative, and it never escapes the family. Then, do you know, and you wonder, like, the toll of that, the weight of that, how heavy that is now, like in 2022. Like,
I mean, I think part of the issue as well with this is that for a lot of the people who survived, their lives were irreparably changed as a result of it. Survivor's guilt was very common. There are a number of early deaths that happen after this. Colonel Archibald Grace, who's one of the characters you see in the film. Do you see him in this one? I think you do.
Yes, he's in it. Yeah.
He was one of the first people to write a book about the disaster not long after, but he died within a year. I mean, he wasn't long for the world himself. There was a number of suicides associated with survivors of Titanic as well, and families. And then, you know, you've already alluded to the court cases that went on and people trying to get compensation. Like, White Star Line cut off pay for their employees the second the ship went down.
Right.
I mean, like, that was their attitude, was that the minute you were ceased to be an employee of the White Star Line, the minute the ship sank.
Wow.
And you didn't get a wage after that. There were instances of people who had children and dependents that had to go through the courts in order to prove that they actually were dependents. I mean, these are the other stories that have been told in other formats, but are part and parcel of that. I mean, it's a very emotive thing. Every story you want on the planet exists within the Titanic. It's a city. It's described as something that's like a city, and all those kind of conflicts are there.
Right, 18. Right, show me where to get out. Hold it! If you please.
But there's room in the boat, I thought.
Women and children only.
I think one of the things that I mean, you sort of almost alluded to, you mentioned the music. For the most part of the film, I don't know if you even realised, there's no music. There's no score apart from whenever the absolute minutes of, and most of it seems to be in the third class, the actual bits of scoring.
I had not noticed that at all, actually.
Mm.
I get it. I mean, this, and actually, when you say that, I'm both surprised and not surprised at all, because the film does not really, except in a few fairly noticeable instances, the film does not attempt any kind of, for want of a better word, cheap emotional manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when Neil talks about the procedural aspect of it, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and it all just inexorably sort of spirals towards disaster.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of clinical detachment from, you know, sort of overt histrionics, and also, you know, they attempt to portray the emotional attitudes of the time as well.
Mm-hmm.
It presents it very starkly, and it just allows the horror to speak for itself.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I mean, when you're seeing sort of dispassionately, we cut to the California where the two guys are going, why is that ship firing rockets?
Mm-hmm.
Probably nothing. Oh, they're still firing rockets. Probably nothing. Oh, it's looking very low on the horizon. Oh, that's the curvature of the earth. And you're screaming internally going, it is sinking. They're all dying. Why don't you know what a distress flare looks like? But because there's no effort to go, da, 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 this is terrible. Imagine how terrible it would be. It's just presented. That's worse than sort of, you know, an attempt to persuade you to have an emotional reaction.
Well, we were talking about Battleship Potemkin and Eisenstein's theories and montage on the show recently.
Oh, were you?
We were, Rachel. If you ever listen back to any of our podcast episodes, you'll find this out.
Rachel don't do Potemkin.
But I mean, when you think about that, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that essentially what's happening here is also a montage. You're not being, you know, it's the juxtapositions of image that are creating our kind of sense of morality and opinion. It's not asking us to judge, for the most part, what happened. It's not telling us that we should feel this way about something. I think the lack of scoring for the film, apart from like, oh my gosh, everything's going to shit kind of scoring. We don't see J. Bruce Ismay and suddenly we get like a, it's like he's not presented as the villain. It's not like we sort of see him in light of how he reacts with somebody else. We don't see Lighthouler as a kind of heroic kind of fanfare whenever he arrives on screen. We're not manipulated in that way. We're not given little insights into other stuff. We just literally see what their stuff is. And again, if you read the book, so much of the book is straight there on the screen. It's literally what the eyewitnesses said happened is what you're shown. We're not asked to question whether or not this is true. We're just like, this is what they say happened. This is probably what actually went down. And you realize as well, because we're getting all these because the eyewitnesses themselves are providing snapshots to the evening, in a way that's kind of why this has to be that way, because we can't see everything that goes on. We literally get, as you're darting down a corridor, you happen to catch Thomas Andrews telling the staff to get their life belts on for themselves, but also for everybody else. That's all we need.
Stewardess.
Yes, sir?
Why aren't you wearing your life belt?
Well, the passengers mustn't think I'm scared.
Let them see you wearing it. Put it on, child. For your own sake, too.
Yeah.
And that tells us a lot about him.
Yeah.
There's some editorializing that goes on too, because obviously there are bits and pieces that we don't really know. Captain Smith's final moments are a very good example of this. But I think that's a big part of it. I think that I thought that lack of scoring was really, really interesting. Obviously, we got the band playing their stuff, and we have a bit of a jig downstairs, which is all good crack.
A lot more Begora.
Yes.
They look like they're having a great time.
Yeah.
All the Irish viewers in the audience are not having a great time. At that point, we're looking at going seriously.
The hearts of all the girls I am the forming, but before the break of morning.
Yeah, but again, this is again where you're kind of looking at what the factual realities of the day were. The Irish weren't in the first class, generally speaking. They're not the first and second class passengers in the way that they are the bulk of the third class passengers.
I'm not disputing. I'm not disputing that for a second.
Are we talking about the racial stereotyping?
I'm also not disputing the fact that there
like
probably
the Scotsman,
were. There probably
and the Scotsman
were a few,
was wee Tam O'Shanter and his.
There probably were a few impromptu Gaelies going on down there. I'm just saying that there's, that's not all. It's not just Begora and music and lusting after Polish women.
Agreed. To be fair, Thomas Andrews is from Cumber. He's a Northern Irishman, and he's presented by the late Michael Goodliffe, who actually himself committed suicide in 1976, very, very horribly. But he's a Northern Irishman, although the accent doesn't come through at any point. There was the ship's doctor.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Good Northern Irish accent there. I was
genuine Belfast accent.
Do you know how I knew it was genuine? Because he never once said Begora.
Hello, Doc.
Hello, Lights.
What's the matter? Somebody ill?
I'm on an errand of mercy.
Oh, hope she's not too young for you.
Oh, you've got an evil mind.
Come in. Hello, Doc. What can I do for you?
You can stop working on this grand ship of yours and have a nightcap.
Well, I got one here.
This is sound medical advice I'm giving you.
So they do exist within the film. There is an authenticity. Also, you'd hope that William McQuitty, as a Belfast man, might actually have wanted to make sure that we were properly represented. But I guess it's the needs of the thing. We also don't see anyone of colour in the film.
No.
There were people of colour on board Titanic.
Right.
We do get a little glimpse of somebody who's a non-English speaker. Again, there were people from all over the world were on board that ship. It wasn't all English-speaking Irish and Americans and English people. Like, it was a lot more than that.
That was a very definite decision, though, by the producers and by, to because it was a British film. And they wanted to portray the British side. I mean, I know a lot of not a lot, but many of the American characters were kind of composited in with sort of other characters that were English to give more English feel. Some of the American characters were left out completely. I think some of the American characters were turned English as well, weren't they?
Quite probably.
Yeah. So I do remember reading that was a deliberate decision, because it was a British film and they wanted to make a British film with which kind of presented it as a British story.
Well, I mean, I guess you've got a class thing too. It's very easy to play it with. I mean, the coding that still exists today. The British played the upper class and the aristocracy, and the possibly ignorant upper class and aristocracy, whereas anybody with an accent is less than that.
Do you really want me to talk about English accents in the 1950s? Because I can do this. We can go down a massive rabbit hole about toga movies and the linguistic paradigm and
Rachel, we will find a podcast for you to do a toga movie just so that we can get it all out of your system. I suspect it'll be like 5 hours long.
Of course it will. There are no toga movies that are not 5 hours long.
But yes, I mean, there are obviously commercial concerns and reasons why they do that. Also, it strikes me that there's quite an easy narrative facilitation, but also the reality is that the people who had the money were a lot of them were English people. A lot of the lower classes on the ship were of other nationalities, were of the regions. So it's not being inauthentic either.
That was one of the things that I kind of picked up on more this time around, was everybody in the upper class and the upper classes seemed to be there for the trip.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas everybody there down below was trying to go to America ultimately to start a better life. That kind of American dream pitch. And it was interesting that everybody kind of up top was just like, we're having a wonderful time and we'll go to New York, do some shopping and come home. That type of thing. And everybody beneath them, figuratively and probably literally, we're doing it to get away from home and never go back. I was kind of struck by that when I watched it.
I mean, it's historically it's true. I mean, this was a run of the mill thing. Someone like John Jacob Astor, who really, I'm not even sure who he is in the film. He's sort of very, very fleetingly, I think, referenced. Richest man, basically, in almost on the planet at the time, is coming back from honeymoon in Egypt with his young mistress, become wife. She was very, very young and pregnant, and like they're literally on holidays. They are doing the grand tour.
Yeah.
Going out, seeing the world, coming home because we got money and we can afford to do it. That sequence where you see them all trying to get their possessions back.
That's fine.
Be quiet. Too many people.
Tessa, here, Tessa, please. I must have my jewels. I must have them. They're in the safe. I've the receipt here to prove it.
Like I think kind of strikes is just the difference. Is like they're clamoring in a big kind of mob to get their jewels, while downstairs they're just clamoring for their lives.
Word's going round that the women and children are taking to the boats.
You can't go through here. This is not the way to the steerage boat deck. I've told you.
Which is the way, then?
They'll be opening the lower deck ports when the orders are given.
Oh, they will they? We'll see about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Those contrasts are very effective.
And I think also the contrast that's making as well is the lower class, third class, the steerage recognize the danger a lot sooner, really, and that's also
probably because it was wetter.
Yeah, it was wetter, but also they're not being kind of babied by the stewards. I mean, in sort of the first class, the stewards are knocking gently on the doors. You point out, Neil, going, "Oh, pardon me, if you wouldn't mind, pop your life jacket on. We'll just go for a little spin around the deck, shall we?
Nothing to worry about.
Everything's fine. There's usually an iceberg sitting right there, sticking out of the hull. That's fine. It's just scenery." And downstairs, they're whacking the door, going, "Get up and put your life jackets on, or you're all going to die. Also, we've locked the doors. You can't get out."
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the but also, I mean, I think there's the sense that the lower classes, the steerage guys, are more used to the fact that actually the world is a bit shit and that bad things happen all the time, and that you're never more than a hair's breadth away from death because you don't have that much control of your life. Whereas, you know, in sort of the first class lives, bad things happen to steerage, but they don't happen in first class.
There's an interesting thing going on in that sequence about individualism and collectivism too, because everybody down below is going, we need to get out of here, and everybody upstairs is going, I need to get my stuff.
That's a really, really good point. Yeah,
you know, so that's in play as well, which is interesting in terms of like the societal aspect of it and how they view the circumstance. That idea of, I need to get my stuff so I'm okay, and a whole room of people going, we need to get out of here, guys. You know, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, and working together, and common goal. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah.
I mean, there's so much at play and so much going on within those relationships and how they're depicted, and I find it fascinating as well, considering the sort of the social economic backgrounds of some of the people creating this. You know, I don't necessarily know that they were completely au fait with the working classes either. I mean, William McQuitty always sort of interests me. He was a kid and he actually saw the Titanic being built and launched as a 5-6-year-old. And that was the start of his relationship. But his dad was sort of in charge of the Belfast Telegraph. You know, he was from a very well privileged position in society. But he's the man that basically ensures that this film is made. And Roy Ward Baker, who I met once doing a documentary for many years ago, I just sat and listened to him for half an hour as he told stories. You know, again, these are not, I don't know, I just don't get the feeling that they're, you know, they're of the people as such. Which is, I'm not to denigrate their input into this. And even in terms of the survivors, the working class people are not the people who generally survived.
Well, it's because they were locked in as a sinking ship.
I mean, but what I'm trying to tease out of that, I guess, is that in spite of the fact that they're the voices that we don't actually have, they are the people that we connect with that social conversation. You know, it clearly impacted a lot of people. You know, they really felt for the social inequality that existed there. There were huge rows about it, even in terms of whenever they started recovering bodies. They managed to get something like 300 odd bodies from the water in the weeks after this. Got a whole new system for identifying bodies that actually we still use a lot of today in a disaster situation. It was used for same sort of principles for 9/11 and stuff. But basically, if they couldn't identify you, about half the bodies were put back into the water.
Oh my God.
You know, they were recorded, possessions were gathered together, but they didn't have space or provisions in order to kind of keep everybody. So about half the bodies were then wrapped in linen and put back into the sea. Well, respectfully, there was a little service for each one anyway. But one of the things that was observed was again, in terms of the bodies that were kept and brought to land, it was the rich. It was the upper classes. It was the officers that you know, were noticeably brought back to land. So even in death, there was a social inequality that existed. And it was something that was picked up at the time. I mean, when this film was made, there were still something like, you know, 80 or 90 survivors of the ship alive. People, you know, this was still living memory. This was living memory for people and that trauma. We're looking at it in 2022, 110 years after the ship went down. There's nobody left. The last person, I think, was 1998 they died. I think it was Milvina Dean was one of the last. Like it's been 20 years near enough since the last of the survivors is gone.
That's more than 20 years, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I would need to double check my references in terms of who died last when. Yeah. It's been a while since I last did this as a regular conversation. I used to have all the tip of my head.
It's a film podcast, not a Maz podcast anyway, so we're covered.
Well, I only pointed out because I am myself prone to think of 1998 as being 5 minutes ago.
That was last week, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't even.
But yeah, I mean, so I think we're able to look at things slightly differently now from how they did then. I think there was this need to be respectful in a way that maybe you could be a little bit more bolder with your assertions today.
I wonder, possibly, but I also wonder if perhaps the emotional mores are very different, and there's less expectation for that kind of stiff upper lip. And it strikes me, the chairman and the character of the chairman, we're not supposed to read that in a positive light. Obviously,
No.
we're supposed to read it as cowardice, but I don't think we're ever given enough to really kind of despise him in the film. And I think possibly for me, the result is that from a modern perspective, those actions look so perfectly understandable. And goodness knows what any of us would do in the same situation, as you say, Neil. I mean, I wouldn't have to think about that. I would be on the lifeboat, most likely, because I'm a woman with kids. So I wouldn't have to have that thought. But even without that, the urge to not drown in sub-zero temperature Atlantic Ocean is a pretty powerful one, surely. And the requirement to overwrite that because of social nicety just seems bizarre and so understandable that somebody would find that they couldn't do that. As despicable as it is, when you know that there are women and children and men and people who have been locked underneath the sinking ships, the waterline of the sinking ships, so that they can't get on the lifeboats. But you can't fault somebody for wanting to live or not wanting to die like that.
It's the one of the conversations we had, that kind of philosophy problem. It's the trolley problem. It's I can send the trolley down this way and it kills one person, or I can send it this way and it kills 10 people. Like, what do you actually do? What is the right answer?
Yeah.
And I don't think there necessarily, I don't think there necessarily is one. I think you get to debate that within the context of that problem and within the context of this film, but I don't think there's a satisfactory answer. There will still be death. There will still be loss.
Exactly. And there is that one guy who is he's a seaman, he's a yachtsman, and he kind of goes, well, I can sail the ship. Shall I get on? As though he's doing it for the good of his out of the good of his heart. And everybody's like, hooray, our hero. I'm just like, okay, yes, no, clearly that is important for him to be on that boat, because without him, it's going to be more problematic for people. But equally, it's okay if he goes. I should probably be on that boat, but it's not okay for the other guy, because we've made a value judgment about how useful a human life is. And yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not, because clearly, big rich guy, hugely privileged, make sure that he's on a life raft when the underprivileged people just are left to die. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm just, this kind of assignment of value to lives, I think, is just.
I mean, all those things though do come up within the stories. I mean, in his instance, I mean, it sort of reminds you about the functions that people had. Like, literally, the right way that these things are done is that we have 2 sailors per ship to kind of keep an eye on things, and they're the people that have the control, and they are not adequately staffed. You've got passengers actually begging for somebody to come on, and again, he's the only person that volunteers his skills. I mean, I think that's in that instance, it's like, yes, he can see the benefit, but there's no way he is not also thinking about the horribleness about what he's escaping from and about the people that are left behind. I mean, families were torn apart by this. You didn't know that you were going to see people again at all. I mean, there is the lifeboat famously that went off with 12 people, including the Duff Gordons, which is in the film. We do see this lifeboat with hardly anyone in it, and they, damn sure they're not going to go back and get anybody else because they'll be swamped. in this lifeboat that could hold over 40 people, and there's only 12 of them. And that is totally about privilege. They actually paid a reward to the crew members that were on board their little boat afterwards. And there's very definitely a moral judgment that I will still make 110 years later about what they were doing and how wrong that was, because that was a bribe in order to pay off their conscience, because they did a bad thing and people died because of them. It's hard not to do that, as upsetting as that might be, to be told that your granddad made a really bad fucking decision and resulted in nobody wants to hear that. But that is also the reality of the situation. Now, whether or not how we'd all behave in it, I don't know. I've often wondered about this, telling the story for years. I've always wondered what I would do in the moment, because I don't want to die.
And equally, you're in the lifeboat and there's space in the lifeboat. There are so many more people in the water than the lifeboat can take. You're in the lifeboat. If all those people try to get into the lifeboat, you're all going to die. That's a situation nobody wants to be. Nobody wants to know what they would do in that situation, because I don't think there's any one of us could say with our hands on our hearts we would definitely go back and risk being capsized by panicking, drowning people.
Yeah,
I'd like to think I would, but I can't say for certain. If my kids were on that boat, I would be saying absolutely not, sail away, because my children, for me, maybe I would do it, but if it was my children, I don't think I could.
That was our conversation too, where it's like, and that phrase, I think, Rachel, is key. You'd like to think that you would, and I like that was a phrase that we said last night, watching back. You'd like to think you'd do the right thing, but I think there is something in everybody that self-preservation, or, to use a more negative term, there is a selfishness that comes on that would make us want to look out for ourselves, look out for our own family. Again, individualism versus collectivism. You'd like to think that you would do the right thing, but I'm not. Like, I can't sit here hand on heart and go, turn that boat around, let's go and pick up some people. Like, I would be an absolute liar if I was to sit here and say that's what I would do 100%.
I mean, altruism is one of the greatest things about us and as a species, and it's one of the reasons why ultimately I think we're going to be okay. But equally, it's fighting against that absolute, prime directive: survive. And that's, how could we ever say that's not going to override altruism?
Yeah, it's all those reflexes, isn't it? Fight or flight and all that stuff. It's all in the mix of all of us, which is really, really interesting in whatever the scenario. But this, that the whole thing was just pretty moving and pretty, like, I didn't quite have the same emotional reaction watching it back this time as I did as a 12-year-old. Maybe that's something about a hardening of my own emotional state over the years. I don't know, but it still makes you have those conversations and those thoughts of what would I do?
Let me take you down to Titanic Quarter, have a wander, and I'll tell you some stories about it and see how that gets you.
I've been round. I did a tour.
Not with me, you haven't.
That's very true. Yeah,
I did a tour once and stood in the outline outside, and that's another thing too. The scale of the actual ship itself is just something that I don't think we can quite fathom.
No.
When you go and stand in that outline, it doesn't give you any concept of height, but it certainly gives you a concept of kind of length and depth of the vessel and what that, like, I didn't realize how huge it was until I was in that outline. But in terms of the film, I think that's, because obviously there's a model that gets used for the actual sinking, which looked really well in terms of like for its time, for its era, and all that type of stuff. Like it really holds up well.
In the film you're talking about?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's there was a fair bit of money put into it. Now it's not James Cameron kind of levels of funding that they've got.
No.
It's all British craftsmanship. It's like sticking the ship on a pond in Ruislip. As well as, I mean, there's a combination. So there's a bit of stuff that they shot on a model, a huge model that they then burnt afterwards. There's also like a sort of as life set of one side of the ship where a lot of stuff is played out, and then they also shot some stuff on board a real ship. Now they did try and film at Harland and Wolff, and to get Harland and Wolff to give them permission to film on one of the ships, and they basically were denied permission. At that point, the Titanic story in Belfast was not what it is now. There was a lot of resistance to having those conversations. People felt, I think part of it again is this living memory thing. The city was trying to bury that association because this had been a shipyard that they were so proud of, that was building the ships that wore out the ocean, as they used to say. As Rachel has pointed out to me before, it was all right when she left here.
Well, that's it. I mean, and that is just the standard response of anybody from Northern Ireland when the Titanic is 110 years on. That is what we say. She was all right when she left here.
Oh, I had a friend who used to say it took 3,000 Irishmen to build Titanic and 1 Englishman to sink it.
I mean, and that does speak to a kind of collective understanding that, you know, probably it's not something to be proud of.
Well, I think the problem was it altered people's perceptions, because it was almost like we did this great achievement that then didn't work out so well. Although there was 2 sister ships that people don't talk about, one of which sailed until 1935 quite happily and could have carried on sailing had it not the company not decided to scuttle it. And it was sailed on by the likes of Cary Grant, went off to America on the Olympic whenever he emigrated. Charlie Chaplin travelled on the Olympic. You know, these sister ships were really important ships. The Britannic served during the First World War and was sank by a torpedo. You know, which, I'm sorry, you can't really fault Harland and Wolff for building a ship that won't stand up to a massive explosion. Like, that's what they're intended to do. But there was obviously the relationship that our city, the city that, you know, we all know, that our country that has had a love-hate relationship with so long, and it's only in the last like 20 years, I think, as the last of those people have died that were connected with the original ship, that we're able to look at this afresh, that we're able to embrace the dark tourism that exists around it, but also to kind of like look at all the stories and go, we'll take ownership of it. Yeah.
I mean, I do remember as a school child, now
you were never a school child.
Apparently I was. In the dim, distant past. And it must have been, I suppose, around about the time that the wreckage was discovered. And as you say, I don't recall there being a resurgence of interest in it. I do recall being aware of the Titanic before that, but I was on a school trip to the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum. And it was the Transport Museum side of it. Things for viewers who are not from Northern Ireland are familiar with this marvellous part. It's a living history sort of exhibit just outside Belfast, and it is just fantastic. And it's just absolutely, they so much fun. But back then they hadn't quite got the same kind of exciting things that you can clamber on. That there was one room that was devoted to the Titanic, and in the middle of the room they had I suppose a scale model of the ship inside one of those glass square cases, and they had these little figures, and in my memory there were 2,200 little figures, and 700 of them were kind of sort of greyish, and 1,500 of them were black, to symbolize how many people died that day. And so there's something so stark and something so moving and something so resonant about the simplicity and the devastation of that image. Now, my memory could be sort of partially faulty with that, but I remember that image and I remember that display.
Oh, the display's still there.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it really?
It's still there.
Okay, because I been there recently and they just seem to have lots of trains, and which is great. Don't get me wrong.
It is definitely still there. I can send you photographs later.
And there was a space capsule a few years ago, which was awesome.
I mean, look, you want to put it into perspective. There's 3 of us on this call. Rachel survives.
There you go.
I mean, that's it in a nutshell.
You did let me be Molly Brown.
The Unsinkable Molly Brown, I don't know if you ever watched the film. It's really disappointing. The Titanic bit from which she got her name is like a tiny, tiny bit at the end of the film.
Oh.
And it includes a bit from A Night to Remember. So, like, that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, of the 3 of us, there's only one of us to survive. And it's
statistically, it's likely me. Yep.
Yeah, because you're the woman and children.
Yep.
We're all, I think, of a relatively similar class. So we're not going to be fighting. It's not like one of us has a class advantage. Generally speaking, although
I'd like to think I have a class advantage of you, Robert.
Well, I mean, I certainly think I'm the most working class of the 3 of us, but it's neither here nor there. But yeah, I mean that's the reality. And when you get down to those sorts of levels, that 1 in 3 is all that survives. I mean that's a massive, massive thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, like for me, I think. Like a lot of what we talk about whenever we're talking about films is about analyzing the films and the structures and trying to pick apart how they're working. Sometimes we're looking at stories and about the issues that they provoke. For me, this film does a really good job of conveying the realities of a horrible, horrible situation.
Yeah.
In a fairly detached way that still leaves you feeling emotional.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a bit of it too. There was a conversation in our house again about could this happen now? With all the technology and the things we would use to check for ice or what have you, like could it actually happen? I think part of the reason it hits home so much is it could, yeah. Like not necessarily ships do still sink, so there's something very there's a possibility, unlikely as it is, but like there is a bit of it that has a kind of odd realism in some ways, if that makes sense.
Comes down to human error, doesn't it? I mean, ultimately, the reason the Titanic sank was because they didn't, for whatever reason, heed the warnings that they were given about ice. They should have, as the other ships in the area did, they should have stopped and not attempted to pass that much ice after dark.
Messages for the captain.
Oh, very good, Sparks.
Would you see he gets them right away?
Certainly. Excuse me, sir. From the wireless room.
Thank you. Excuse me. Ice warnings from steamers ahead of us. Excuse me. Serious? Oh, we shall keep a sharp lookout.
So it's human error. They made a judgment call and it was a bad one. And that can happen anytime. So much of this comes down to human error.
There is also a line at the start of the film when they're on the train and the guy on the train says, they say that she is unsinkable. They say that man has finally discovered how to conquer nature. And I thought that was a very interesting line because clearly not. Like those those kind of joked about war movies where it's like, I'm heading home tomorrow to see my sweetheart. And you go, nope, he's dead.
You're not. Yeah.
He's dead before this ends. Do you know that type of
I'm popping out for a minute. I'll be right back.
Yeah, those kind of lines. But and I know that's because obviously we know this story. But I thought it was just a very interesting line in terms of, can you ever really have control over nature? In that sense, I think that's an interesting aspect to it.
I mean, the line that's usually used, and I can't remember who it's attributed to, was that it was supposedly said that God himself could not sink the ship.
Which is basically like saying, come on, have a go, isn't it?
Flag to a bull. Hello. Have a go.
That's that Michael Jordan Last Dance thing where he says, and I took that personally.
I mean, the one thing that I wanted to kind of, just before we kind of wrap this up, was to pick out as well, it's not just about this disaster. There's a point where they start jumping off the ship and what you know is a futile gesture. I mean, you've actually heard Thomas Andrews tell people, don't jump off the side of the ship. You will, people got injured and died that way because of the impact of the icy cold water on them, let alone the hypothermia that set in pretty darn quickly. But I was talking about, I mean, that watching this again makes me think of 9/11 and the footage of the jumpers from that.
Yeah.
Like, and which also involved, that was 3,000 people died in 9/11. We're talking about comparative numbers in terms of like one mighty edifice, the tallest building in New York. There are comparisons that you can draw between the two things. It's just that right now 9/11 is still within living memory. It's still probably slightly too uncomfortable, but in another 20, 30, 40 years, it's prime for these kind of films.
There's also an interesting thing there about control in terms of this is going to happen. So do I let it happen or do I control how it happens? Which I think is quite an interesting bit of the human psyche too. Because, don't jump because this will happen. And it's like, well, if I stay here, we're pretty assured that this is going to happen. So this might actually be quicker to jump.
At least I know I'll be unconscious.
And in some ways might be more genteel away. If that's a weird word to use in that context, but do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, absolutely. If you were to ask me, the one I always look at is Jochen the baker. It's a true story. He was the baker on board the ship, and basically he resigns himself to dying, so he decides to get drunk, and then at some point during the night gets a change of conscience and decides to go up and try and help himself. He spends his time throwing off sort of deck chairs and stuff into the water to act as flotation devices, and he ends up riding the ship down into the water. He's on the back of the ship as it goes under. We don't see that in Night to Remember, but that's where he ends up. He is literally one of the last people on board the ship. And somehow, despite the fact he is pissed, something you're told never to do before you go for a swim, he manages to find himself to the upturned lifeboat and lives and tells his tale. I mean, like, I don't know. I just think that's maybe where you want to be. Just like, it is what it is. Stuff happens and kind of just ride it out and see.
Might as well just get drunk. Words to live by.
Okay, final thoughts on this before we go?
Is it, as far as I'm concerned, the only film about the Titanic from now on?
Neil?
Yeah, like I say, it was good to revisit it again, all these years apart. And yeah, I didn't quite find myself getting as emotional, but it kind of just got me. It kind of got me a wee bit philosophically, as you're probably picking up from some of the things I've said, like kind of debating what we're about and what we would do, and what that aspect really came through for me. And yeah, it's worth a watch if anybody's listened to this and hasn't watched it and has seen the Cameron version of the story. I would put this over and above that from what little I've seen of it. Yeah.
I'm just going to support this. This is a rare occasion where I think the three of us may actually be on the same page.
Oh my goodness! All it took was a massive human catastrophe for that to happen.
Like for me, I think this is a brilliant film. It's not without its visual flaws. There are factual errors within the film, but as Rachel's alluded to earlier on, some of that is because of our way that we've changed our interpretation and understanding of what happened at the time. But for me, this is an excellent film. It's an excellent production, and it tells the story in such an economic and efficient and beautiful way. And I would challenge you not to feel something by the end of it. And if you don't feel anything about the film, think about yourself. It is available. Like, you can get it on Blu-ray. It's released by Criterion in the US. It's out on where is it out here? Rank. ITV Studios in the UK. have it on Blu-ray, nice shiny Blu-ray. You can probably get it on streaming services too. And there's also Walter Lord's original book, which I thoroughly recommend you picking up. If you've never read any account of the Titanic, it is quite digestible. It's a very easy read, and I also still find it quite emotional too. Rachel, Neil, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chatting with me again.
Oh, thank you.
Folks at home, if you've enjoyed this, do hit the subscribe button if you don't already. Tell your friends about it. Do follow us on our social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. We also have a mailing list, so go on to CinePunked.com, sign up to our mailing list. You'll keep Rachel very happy.
You will. Yes, I'll be delighted.
And we send stuff through, and as per usual, just interact with us on social media and catch us again in your ears and eyes very, very soon. Good night.
Carpathia. Aren't you glad to see her?
Yes, I'm glad. But then I'm still alive.
If only she'd been nearer.
There are quite a lot of ifs about it, aren't there, Colonel? If we'd been steaming a few knots slower, or if we'd sighted that berg a few seconds earlier, we might not even have struck. If we'd carried enough lifeboats for the size of the ship instead of just enough to meet the regulations, things would have been different again, wouldn't they? I've been at sea since I was a boy. I've been in sail. I've even been shipwrecked before. I know what the sea can do. But this is different.
Because we hit an iceberg?
No. Because we were so sure. Because even though it's happened, it's still unbelievable. I don't think I'll ever feel sure again. About anything.